On spring nights in 1799, as the moon rose above the limestone cliffs of the Avon Gorge near Bristol, a figure could sometimes be seen wandering along the paths above the river, carrying a green silk bag. From time to time, he would pause, lift the bag to his mouth, inhale deeply through a wooden tube, and then stand silently gazing in awe at the landscape around him. Afterwards, he would write hurried notes in a notebook. The bag contained nitrous oxide, a substance later to become known as laughing gas. And the figure was the scientist Humphry Davy. He was barely 20 years old, but already one of the most daring experimental minds of his age. Welcome, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. And in this episode, we're going to hear about Humphry Davy, about nitrous oxide, because they're both part of what we should call the first British psychedelic age. Not the 1960s, but the 1790s, over 200 years ago, when a group of scientists, poets, philosophers, and industrialists gathered in a kind of proto-countercultural community down in Bristol to push the limits of both science and consciousness. Well, I've been pushing forward the boundaries of my consciousness with the Bureau of Lost Culture for over 6 years now, yikes. It's a privilege and an education, I can tell you. It's a lot of work and time. And if you can be one of those who help support this crazy endeavour via our Patreon, go to bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks to all those who already have and have helped keep this endeavour ad-free. Nobody wants to hear me pushing them to buy more stuff they don't need. Your support doesn't need to be financial. It's sustaining just to hear from people and to hear how much they've appreciated these stories. Back to today. My guest, Mike J. You might recognise him from previous episodes. He talked previously about the history of mescaline, high society, and most recently, the secret history of the psychonauts. Now, Mike's an ethnographic cultural historian who writes on drugs, medicine, politics, madness, and the mind. And his latest book, Free Radicals: How a Group of Romantic Experimenters Gave Birth to Psychedelic Science. It's an amazing story of a time long ago when many of the things that became important during the counterculture were already established. So buckle up. Let's get in the time machine and head back to the late 18th century. On this extremely warm London day, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Bureau of Lost Culture cultural historian Mike J. Hello, Mike.
A pleasure to be here again, and wishing it was a few degrees cooler.
I was just thinking it's a perfect day to sort of huff some nitrous oxide and take a walk through the Avon Gorge, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's coming up to a full moon. So Humphry Davy, one of our famous protagonists, would be looking at doing exactly that. He'd be getting his chemical reaction going and filling up an enormous great green silk bag with nitrous oxide and wandering out of his laboratory up the Avon Gorge and sit there under the full moon with his notebook kind of composing poetry.
Well, listeners, if that's all sounding a bit strange and weird, you're going to find out exactly why that is. And nitrous oxide is one of the gases that's at the centre of this story, which of course in these times has become associated with these little sort of silver capsules that young people could buy from joke shops and sort of briefly get high and laugh maniacally and sort of fall about, right? But in fact, it was far from that in this time, wasn't it?
Yeah, in a way, also, it was not so far from that.
Free Radicals: How a Group of Romantic Experimenters Gave Birth to Psychedelic Science. That's your latest book. It's got a lot of connections, I think, with psychonauts and high society, actually. And I said, a little bit in the intro, but it's these three figures, Thomas Beddoes, Joseph Priestley, and Humphry Davy, in this sort of circle. Certainly in Britain anyway, it was the origins of psychedelic science. And it's right inside the Romantic era. There's a few terms as it were, to sort of get straight here. When we talk about the Romantics and the Romantic era, we're not just talking about sort of poets mooning away under windows and, looking forlornly across the lawns of stately homes, are we? Tell us what the Romantic era was, or in the context of your research.
Yeah, I mean, it emerges from the other period that we sort of call the Enlightenment, which is a bit vague, but it's mostly then we're talking about like the the 18th century and the rise of science and scientific discovery and what our man here, Thomas Beddoes, called deciphering the world, figuring out how everything works, how old, the universe is and what the building blocks of it and what stuff's made of and all that physical stuff. And then romanticism that emerges out of that is a bit of a turn towards the subjective. So it's like saying, well, okay, we're deciphering the outside world, but what about ourselves? What about our own minds? What's going on there? The way that we as individuals see the world is different from anybody else's. Let's explore inner space, as it were. So I think these nitrous oxide experiments are a kind of really fantastic, sort of pivot between that Enlightenment era and the Romantic era, which takes that knowledge and turns it inwards.
Right. So in a world where religious theologies are sort of held dominance, you've got the rise of science and you've got the rise of these scientists, you might call them, investigators of the secular world. But they're also seeing us as subjects for research, and not only us sort of physically as physical bodies, but our minds as well, like inner space, as you said. It wasn't that they were making a distinction like, okay, the philosophers and the poets are over here investigating consciousness, and then the scientists are over there and they're sort of looking at atoms and chemistry and physics and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's right. They all kind of come together, and they come together amazingly in these nitrous oxide experiments, because once you have this, it's the first time that, a mind-altering psychedelic drug has ever been discovered in the laboratory. For the people who discover it, it's just like, this is extraordinary. How can it be that a lungful of this gas that, as far as anybody knows, never existed before. Not only does it give you this incredible rush of pleasure and euphoria, without any cause, you can't explain what's happening except you just feel amazing and euphoric, but also you have these kind of epiphanies, these revelations, if you huff enough of it, you go into this kind of different space where you see a sort of alternate universe that feels more real and more true than the one you've spent your life living in. So how can that be? As you say, within the religious view of the world, all the higher cerebral functions, that's all God-given. But suddenly it's not God-given. It's coming out of a lungful of this gas that you just created in the lab.
So I can't imagine how extraordinary that must have been. So take us back to actually the discovery of nitrous oxide, the sort of separate element or gas, and who discovered that actually it had these effects. Because it's not obvious to me that you're in a lab, you may think you've discovered some gas, can't really see anything, but then what would sort of tempt you also to sort of lean over and take a big breath of it?
A lot of that is about medicine. Thomas Beddoes, who's our central figure here, is a doctor, and he's got this extraordinary thing together. The first example of what we'd call now a medical research institute. So this is in an era before drugs and chemicals are a big part of medicine, before experiment of this kind is done very much. Particularly, he's interested in consumption, pneumonia, lung diseases. So he's thinking maybe there's a whole new type of medicine that instead of it being a pill that you swallow or a cream you rub on your skin, it's something you inhale into your lungs, and it deals with these lung diseases. So his kind of radical idea is, all these new gases that are being created by people like Joseph Priestley and others, who knows what they do medically? Let's just get a project together where we synthesize them all and we see if they're any use in medicine. So that's the original impulse. And nitrous oxide Joseph Priestley had synthesized it himself, but he hadn't inhaled it. He had inhaled oxygen, and so people knew already that oxygen had special properties. Priestley had showed if you took two mice and you put them in bell jars and you filled one with air and the other with oxygen, the one in oxygen would live longer. So there must be some kind of special spirit of life in there, but nobody had inhaled nitrous oxide. People assumed it was poisonous, but Beddoes' young lab assistant, 20-year-old Humphry Davy, who was incredibly sort of bold experimenter, he just huffed a little bit of it and went, okay, didn't feel any ill effects, not poisonous, I'll huff a little bit more, and kept going. And then he felt this, as he described it, a thrilling in my chest and extremities, this kind of pins and needles, this sort of effervescent feeling, and thought, what happens if I feel more? And kept on going until he found himself just kind of lifted out of the world he'd spent his life in a totally different dimension.
Absolutely amazing. So these were a bunch of people who were unafraid to experiment on themselves. There's a strange gas, I'm going to inhale it and see what happens. You talk to elsewhere about people who used to inject themselves in their penises and do all sorts of stuff. I mean, we don't live in that age anymore. In the orthodox scientific world, there's plenty of people experimenting themselves in the underground countercultural world. Nitrous oxide, it's at the centre of this thing. The other thing which seems really significant, which runs through this whole narrative, is that it's radical. It's there in the titles. The title of the book is Free Radicals. And that's a quite clever title because it works on several levels. I mean, chemically, free radicals are these unstable reactive elements, and politically, it's like a free radical. It's like a revolutionary reformer. Socially, it's individuals who are sort of detached from conventional structures. And of course, even psychologically, right, it's pointing towards liberated states of consciousness. And the political aspect of it is really interesting because you start off the book, right, with riots on Bastille Day in 1791. I'd never heard of these riots. Bastille Day, obviously, I just associate with France. So tell us about the Birmingham riots of Bastille Day and why that is relevant for this story.
The French Revolution in 1789, a lot of people in Britain are excited by it because they think, the French have had this absolute monarchy, all through the 18th century. This is going to be a modern progressive system. And then over the next couple of years, it becomes obvious that this is not going to be sitting down with Parliament and coming to a sensible arrangement. This has got an awful lot more bloodshed and mobs, and people start to get more and more worried about it. Edmund Burke, actually, who was a friend of Joseph Priestley, who was the first person in 1790 to say, look, what's happening in France is going to go horribly, horribly wrong. And he also makes the link between scientific experiment and this kind of political experiment that's going in France. And he's saying we can't allow, this small group of intellectuals just to kind of throw everything up in the air and see what happens. He talks about the French Revolution as being a wild gas, that a huge ferment that is kind of disturbing everything. And basically, scientists are going around just blowing everything up just to see what happens. And that's what they're also trying to do, to our politics and our constitution and our monarchy. So the British establishment at this point in our modern political terms, does a big lurch to the right and becomes very conservative and very opposed to experiment. So scientific experimenters are kind of seen in the same light, and they often are the same people. I mean, Joseph Priestley was nonconformist. He regarded himself as a sort of man of God first, and chemistry was his hobby. The two are inseparable. And then as you get more and more anxiety about the French Revolution, you get the sort of the British establishment and the aristocracy and the nobility kind of supporting these what are called church and king mobs. This popular unrest, they start to get more violent and more paranoid. In Bristol is where these biggest riots kicks off, and as soon as it kicks off, all decide to descend on Joseph Priestley's house and destroy his laboratory. And
this is one of the themes which, of course, echoes forward through time, isn't it? Because the fear of the authorities, of the disruptive force of, let's call them psychedelics, just as a sort of convenient term, right? That was obviously to rebound massively, wasn't it, in the 50s, 60s and 70s?
Yeah, that's right.
Priestley's home and laboratory gets attacked, right, by this loyalist mob. Passions are running very high. But tell us about Thomas Beddoes, because he's the sort of main protagonist, isn't he, right? In some senses, he's like a kind of countercultural prototype.
Yeah, he is, very much. He's a figure who, in many ways, lives much more in our world than he does, in his own time. He teaches chemistry at Oxford. He's got an idea that came from France, another revolutionary idea, Lavoisier's idea of chemistry, that this is all just elements that you can put together. He's also a geologist, so he knows perfectly well that, the Earth is billions of years old when everybody else thinks it was created in 4004 BC. He's anti-slavery, he's kind of in favour of gender equality, progressive education. All this seems obvious to him because he's a very smart, learned man, and he's convinced that's the way the world's going. And Priestley is one of his mentors. But after the Priestley riots, Priestley he hid out in Hackney for a bit among the kind of dissenters and Quakers and people who protected him. But he eventually had to kind of leave the country and go to America. In a way, Thomas Beddoes inherits his mantle. But Oxford is all very royalist and very anti-French Revolution. And Beddoes is not a man who's very politic and good at hiding his political opinions. So it becomes pretty obvious he's not going to prosper in that world. Everybody's suspicious of him. So he heads off to this kind of counterculture, really, in Bristol, where he settles. This is a world of nonconformists, Unitarians and Quakers. And these are people who are all excluded from the British establishment. Legally, they're not allowed to be civil servants. And especially the wealthy ones, the great industrialists and Beddoes' circle, they're the people who fund him. He doesn't get any funding from the Royal Society, whatever. So he's in this world where he can operate slightly under the radar and be protected by this counterculture, this sort of, if you remember alternative London from the 1960s, this is a kind of alternative Britain. They've got their own schools, they've got their own universities, they've got their own institutions. They take care of themselves.
That's the extraordinary thing about it. And it's not just about science, it's not just about laboratory, it's right across the culture. I mean, Beddoes himself is this kind of Renaissance figure, isn't he? He's sort of an expert in all sorts of stuff, and he's certainly not going to be hidebound. Bristol's an interesting one too, Mike, I thought, because I haven't actually done anything about Bristol yet in terms of counterculture, but Bristol's like Liverpool, like Hull, and in fact, if you go in the world, like St. Petersburg, Leningrad, they're ports. And the thing about ports is that they tend to be culturally much more open, don't they? Because you've got people coming and going. They're on the edge anyway, right? There tend to be these places where, culturally speaking, or counterculturally speaking, you get much more creative potential.
Yeah, reputation of Bristol at that time, not quite as rich as it had been the generation before, losing a bit of trade already to Liverpool and Glasgow, but it's got rich, and the big business there is slavery, sugar. The real establishment of Bristol, the merchant venturers, that side of Bristol is still there, but also by this point, there's more kind of Quakers and, nonconformists in Bristol than anywhere else in the country. They've set up their own networks. They've got their own ethical products. They don't want slave-produced sugar, so they've got their own business kind of bringing in ethical sugar from sort of the East Indies and stuff. They've got that kind of thing that you still see in Bristol now, of a self-sustaining cultural network. So Bristol's then has got the two sides to it that are still very recognisable now.
Kind of proto-bohemia. And attracting, poets and experimenters. Again, the echoes of, what we call the counterculture in the following centuries. You'd get these people drawn to this place because of this alternative society, right? Let's talk about the Pneumatic Institution, or maybe even before that, this strange thing called the Lunar Society.
That's kind of up in Birmingham, that network of Priestley and Watt and Bolton, Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, who was, the most famous doctor and the most famous poet in Britain. They were a bunch of amazingly brilliant industrialists and scientists and general kind of tinkerers with everything. And they were known as the Lunar Society because they used to meet once a month when there was a full moon and they could walk to each other's houses. Beddoes is kind of a sort of protege of that circle, and he sets up something a bit similar to it in Bristol. The way he engages with the world, he's just an amazing polymath and very social and lots of friends. So as soon as Beddoes arrives in Bristol, he becomes this attractor for all sorts of people who range from, young romantic poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, who are both from the west of England, and they've come to Bristol because they've got some breathing space there away from where they grew up. And there's aristocrats. A lot of them come there for the medical reasons. Consumption or tuberculosis is this really big killer at this point, and a lot of people go to Bath, of course, to take the waters, and there's all kinds of healers and quacks and stuff, and that's spread into Bristol, kind of down at the mouth of the Avons, where, there's a big community of people who are having consumption cures and being put up in boarding houses. What Thomas Beddoes needs, he's learnt from Erasmus Darwin how to earn your living as a doctor, and, the Darwin system is basically charge the rich through the nose and treat the poor for free. Beddoes needs to be somewhere where there are a lot of rich people he can make money out of, but he also needs to be somewhere where there are a lot of poor people who he can treat with his kind of experimental therapies. So that's why he ends up there, and that's also why a lot of other people have ended up there as transients. And so that's why the circle that he gets together there has this incredible mixture of kind of doctors and surgeons and chemists and poets and philosophers.
I mean, it is a quite extraordinary mix, and forgive me for this kind of comparison because sort of sounds a bit too current and maybe a little bit cheesy, but the thing which struck me about some of these, the big industrialists and the scientists, the role that they occupied in the society, it's a little bit like the tech bros now, in the sense that they're entrepreneurial, they are extremely intelligent, they are inventing things left, right and centre, but also they're sort of a bit cool. Or they're kind of like outside the establishment. You know, the tech bros now, they never see them in anything but a T-shirt and trainers, even though they're kind of like heading behemoth multinationals, you know. They've got something of that too, isn't it? Because they're also slightly disapproved of too. We're not quite sure what they're up to. Coleridge, so these are poets mixing with scientists. This was a time when the distinction between the sciences and the arts was much more ambiguous, much more kind of porous than it is now, actually, right? It was like it was completely fine to be somebody who is investigating atoms and then sort of put your microscope away and start writing some poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other way in which they're a bit like the tech bros is that they don't need the establishment. They've got money of their own, and the tech bros have got more money than most kind of, medium-sized countries. They don't need, governments, they don't need scientific institutions. And it was a bit the same with people like Bolton and Watt. They didn't need the kind of patronage that everybody else needed. Anybody else in Beddoes' position would have to go to the Royal Society and kind of apply for funding. Beddoes doesn't have to do that. He can go straight to these kind of super rich industrialists and they'll help give him what he needs. And he gets James Watt to design all his gas equipment and everything. One of the differences now is that, scientists and tech people these days tend not to have much of a hinterland. But, someone like Beddoes or Erasmus Darwin, they were poets. Erasmus Darwin was, as I said, like a really famous popular poet. He wrote all about, this is narratives about nature in rhyming couplets. They were like the sort of David Attenborough documentaries. So it's like, here's the whole natural world kind of laid out for the general reader.
Here is a sidebar with some extracts from Erasmus Darwin's epic poetry. Creation of the cosmos. Let there be light, proclaimed the Almighty Lord. Astonished, chaos heard the potent word. Through all his realms the kindling ether runs, and the mass starts into a million suns. Earths round each sun with a quick explosions burst, and second planets issue from the first, bend as they journey with projectile force, in bright ellipses their reluctant course. Orbs wheel in orbs round centres roll, and form, self-balanced, one revolving whole. Onward they move amid their bright abode. Phosphorescence. You light with light gas the lamp's nocturnal feed, which dance and glimmer over the marshy mead, shine round calendula at twilight hours, and tip with silver all her saffron flowers. Warm on her mossy couch the radiant worm, guard from cold dews her love illuminated form. From leaf to leaf conduct the virgin light, star of the earth and diamond of the night. You bid, in air, the tropic beetle burn, and fill with golden flame his winged urn, or gild the surge with insect sparks that swarm round the bright oar, the kindling prow alarm, or arm in waves electric in his ire, the dread gymnotus with ethereal fire. Onward his course, with wavering tail he helms, and mimic lightnings scare the watery realms.
Beddoes, as well as all the things we've talked about, I mean, he had Latin and he had Greek, but he also, read and translated from French and German and Spanish and Italian. And because he understood German, he knew, for example, about the Bible, all those German scholars who were going, well, this is basically a series of Bronze Age myths. So he had all that. He was reading the German romantics, Schiller and people who Coleridge was obsessed with. So, young Coleridge just went round to Beddoes' house where he had these amazing bookshelves, access to all this incredible philosophy and kind of, things in multiple languages. It was because I think the scientists' interest was so broad. The poets were also interested in chemistry and science, and Coleridge became, as a result of all this nitrous oxide stuff, huge friends with Humphry Davy. And then when Humphry Davy went on to be a lecturer in London at the Royal Institution, then Coleridge would always go along and he'd say, I need to replenish my stock of metaphors. chemistry was full of all these amazing trains of thought and things that he could catch in poetry. So they have a sense that they're all kind of collaborating on the same projects. They're all looking at the same thing, and the more different perspectives, the better.
That's definitely a distinction between the tech bros, isn't it? I mean, there's nothing to compare between one of Coleridge's poems and a bunch of tweets from Elon Musk. So Beddoes had created the Pneumatic Institution. So it's partly like this medical research centre, and it's partly this experimental social space. It reminded me a little bit of the arts labs in the 60s and 70s. So you've got all these people mingling together. And let's talk about Humphry Davy. I mean, he's this charismatic young genius. I knew Humphry Davy because he invented a lot of stuff, didn't he? But he was famous for this lamp, Humphry Davy's lamp. So I was quite surprised to find out about his earlier life, or maybe it was his other life, including nitrous oxide experimentation. And of course, according to you, he's the person who wrote the first trip report. So let's hear about Humphry Davy, and after that first puff that you described, or first huff, should I say, huff of nitrous oxide, what he started to do with it and how he pushed it, this sort of self-experimentation as far as he could.
Yeah, I mean, he's an extraordinary wild card in this. Beddoes' his best friend, and someone says to him, you should check out this young lad in Penzance. You know, he's a genius at chemistry, and nobody's ever heard of Penzance. You know, there's no serious education, and, you know, apart from sort of basic school in Penzance, they've just got their first library. I mean, the idea of an intellectual genius coming from Penzance was absurd.
For international listeners, Penzance is in Cornwall, and it's right at the very sort of western tip of the UK, so you can't get any further right.
That's right. It's really remote, and all anybody knew about it was smugglers and pirates. But then this kind of young lad growing up there just turns out to be a kind of natural genius at chemistry, and also a poet, actually. Like as a young sort of teenager, he's more into his poetry than his chemistry. There's one sort of French emigre priest there, and he kind of just hangs on with him till he's learnt enough French to read Lavoisier's chemistry textbook in French, and he gets the hang of that, and he starts doing these experiments. And as a young teenager, he's just like scouting around kind of old shipwrecks, and he finds an old enema syringe, and he kind of rigs it up and creates this experiment where he uses it to pump out a vacuum inside a glass bottle, and inside the glass bottle he puts a clockwork mechanism on a block of ice, and then he shows that, you know, the clockwork mechanism as it moves around melts the ice even though there's no air in there. I mean, he's doing all this stuff spontaneously. You know, he's a complete genius, but he's also very, very ambitious. In a way, he's the cuckoo in the nest. He does this extraordinary work at the Pneumatic Institution, but then as soon as he's made his name, which he does with his nitrous oxide experiments, he suddenly becomes like the most brilliant young chemist in Britain. He's straight off to London, as he writes proudly to his mother, you'll be glad to see I'm among the royalists now. You know, he's definitely like a bit of a social climber, and he marries very well, and he joins the Royal Society and becomes its president, and eventually becomes a baronet and discovers all these new elements, sodium and potassium and things. But actually the funny thing about the miner's lamp is, even though he's like a chemical genius, and this is also part of the nitrous oxide story, you can make these incredible chemical discoveries, but then actually applying them to industry or to medicine is a lot harder than people think. So he spent a really long time, you know, trying to work out, for example, better ways of tanning leather than the sort of traditional way, which was to just sort of piss on it and, you know, leave it in the sun. And in the process of that, he discovered that tannin and all kinds of chemical reactions, but he couldn't actually make anything that was better than what tanners had been using for generations. So the reason that we hear about the Davy miner's lamp is that this is like actually quite a rare example of something discovered in a lab actually being industrially useful.
The extraordinary thing about him is that he keeps taking the nitrous oxide, and, you know, we mentioned at the beginning, you know, I said to you, perfect day to sort of huff some nitrous oxide and go wandering in the Avon Gorge, because that's of course what he did, right? So
that's right.
Tell us about that, about, you know, what he was doing, how often he was doing it, and he was recording it as well. That's why it becomes a sort of trip report, doesn't it?
I mean, as soon as he discovers this, it's such an extraordinary thing that there's this gas that gives you this completely altered state of consciousness that no one's experienced before. So he keeps on experimenting with it. Partly it's ethical. If you're a doctor, you wouldn't experiment on a patient. So experimenting on yourself is like, I'm going to go first. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I'm not going to risk anybody else's life but mine. So but it's also for Davy, feeds into his ambition. It's like, this is a way that I can discover something that nobody's discovered before. I can inhabit these new states of consciousness and I can figure out what's going on. So he's doing a lot of chemical and biological work. He's got all sorts of animals in the lab, that he's, putting in jars full of nitrous oxide. And then afterwards, he's taking blood samples and seeing how much of the gas is devolved in the bloodstream. He's doing all that proper scientific work. Another really important part of it is the state of consciousness that it produces. So you want to capture that. So how do you describe it? It's famously ineffable, very hard to describe. You feel great. You quite possibly burst out laughing. Some people feel it kind of really stimulated and energized. Other people feel a bit kind of sedated and anesthetized. What's going on? So he kind of kept on taking more and more to try and figure out what was going on. He combined it with alcohol and other gases. And then he ended up saying, what happens if I take as much as I possibly can? So his climactic experiment, James Watt has designed him this kind of thing. It's a bit like a telephone booth that you can pump gas into, and that's actually designed for patients who are so weak that they can't hold the airbag of gas up to their mouth, so you can be in a sort of saturated atmosphere. So he sits himself in there and gets someone to kind of pump nitrous oxide into that box for an hour until he thinks he's completely saturated, and then steps out and grabs this enormous great silk bag full of it and huffs on that, and as much as he possibly can. And then he gets to the point where he completely, loses connection with external things. As he says, the laboratory that he's in disappears, all his sort of senses get overwritten. He suddenly finds he's in this kind of different universe. As he says, it's all composed of thoughts and impressions. And it's like a world of ideas where you can just make all these connections and make discoveries all the time. And he, describes this in fantastic detail. And people had taken drugs before and it often usually just noted, my pulse was, this, or my heartbeat was that,
Here is a sidebar about Humphry Davy and about his book Researches Chemical and Philosophical, chiefly concerning nitrous oxide, published in London in 1800. And as apparent from that title, the book is about chemistry. It describes laboratory procedures, apparatus, and chemical reactions. In the main, it's pretty dry, even impenetrable for non-scientists, I found. But in the final sections, there are passages that read less like chemistry notes and more like travel writing from inner space, accounts of exhilaration, visionary thoughts, and the transformation of perception. At the time, these accounts must have been startling. 2 centuries later, they seem remarkable. What Mike has described as the first modern examples of trip reports from a time when Britain was the world leader in gonzo drug experiments. One was by Thomas Wedgwood, heir to the great pottery dynasty, founded by his grandfather Josiah Wedgwood. Thomas, who was originally interested in exploring treatments for his chronic ill health, became fascinated by the effects of nitrous oxide and quickly became one of its most enthusiastic huffers. He noticed something that later psychedelic researchers would recognise immediately. The gas seemed to amplify the mind's natural processes. And after inhaling, he reported a sudden cascade of thoughts and a rush of sensation and emotional excitement, writing that it produced a rapid succession of vivid ideas, an overwhelming sense of pleasure. Perception took on a luminous intensity. Nitrous oxide did not behave like an ordinary intoxicant. Instead, it produced a state hovering between bodily excitement and heightened consciousness. Another participant was the physician Peter Mark Roget, later to compile Roget's Thesaurus. He carefully recorded the physical changes produced by the gas, altered breathing stimulation, and that strange exhilaration that followed inhalation. A rapidity of pulse and a sense of warmth pervaded the body, he said. The sensation soon rose to a degree of pleasurable emotion difficult to describe. Future poet laureate Robert Southey threw himself into the experiments with enthusiasm too. Writing afterwards to his brother, he attempted to capture the strange delight produced by the gas. Such a gas, Davy has discovered. It made me laugh and tingle in every toe and fingertip. Davy has actually invented a new pleasure for which language has no name. Oh, excellent airbag. Some of the most interesting passages in Davy's book describe experiments conducted outside the laboratory, by himself, on himself. On May the 5th, at night, after walking for an hour amidst the scenery of the Avon, I respired 6 quarts of newly prepared nitrous oxide. After the first inspiration, the dizziness gradually disappeared and was surrounded by a sensation analogous to gentle pressure on all the muscles, and a highly pleasurable thrill, particularly in the chest and extremities. The result was a state hovering between waking and dreaming. The dramatic cliffs of the Avon Gorge beneath the brilliant full moon, the steep limestone walls, the silver light on the dark river. The world seemed to sharpen. Colours brightened, sounds grew more distinct, and thoughts accelerated into unexpected patterns. Images flashed through his mind with extraordinary vividness. The landscape became charged with meaning. The gas seemed to awaken a poetic impulse. He wrote several poems inspired by its experiments. Yet are my eyes with sparkling lustre filled. Yet are my limbs with inward transport thrilled and clad with new-born mightiness all around.
He really goes inside in this kind of proto-romantic manner and tries to engage, with the experience, not as a kind of dispassionate, objective scientist, but as a disembodied being in a new world.
I love that, because that's like the feedback loop, isn't it, of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The poets were getting influenced and inspired by the chemistry. And this is like the chemists getting inspired by the poets.
Yeah, very much.
So that his scientific record, as it were, of what happens is actually becomes very poetic in itself. By the way, that thing you just said about the telephone box, that sounds a bit like hotboxing. You probably know what hotboxing is.
Yeah.
For any innocents out there, it's the practice of smoking cannabis in a small, unventilated, enclosed space like a car or a bathroom to fill the room with smoke, and leads to an amplified effect. I'm not recommending it, by the way. Mike, it's confession time. Have you tried nitrous oxide yourself?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, when I was first writing about this, well over 20 years ago, it was not a thing that was in popular culture, really. It was around in the 60s. The Grateful Dead famously had like a big hospital tank of it in their tour bus, and they used to kind of half off it. But that was kind of the way in which it was available. And he's someone who was a hospital orderly, and people who discovered it if there was this tank of gas down in the basement, you could fill up a big black bin liner and just huff on it and stuff. That was always very dangerous. There were quite a lot of casualties. I think that's why it didn't catch on in the 60s, because if you've got a huge, great tank of gas and you just start huffing off it, then when you pass out, you asphyxiate and die. So when you started seeing it in kind of street drug scene, when people had realized that, it comes in these little canisters, the whipped cream canisters, and then you discharge one of those into a balloon, and then you inhale from the balloon. And first, it doesn't freeze your lungs because it's not so cold, but also it's actually this pretty neat harm reduction device, because if you're inhaling from a balloon and you pass out or whatever, you drop the balloon and you start breathing normal air and you're okay. So I think that was when it really took off. And what's funny about that is it so exactly recapitulates what the Pneumatic Institution did, because James Watt himself designed, this green silk bag and this apparatus where you'd heat ammonium nitrate and, you'd store it there and you'd tap it off into a green silk bag. The reason that it hit youth culture when it did was because people suddenly figured out exactly what these guys had been doing 200 years ago. They rediscovered it.
Young people, if they'd known about this, when met with the disapproval of their parents, their elders, and the authorities, could have said that they're just following in the tradition of Humphry Davy and James Watt, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's indeed. A lot of scientists did through the 19th century, when everything got a bit more censorious and drug experimenting was a bit frowned on. You get a lot of scientists 100 years later saying, well, in the great tradition of Humphry Davy, I decided to inhale some ether or whatever.
It's not just a frivolous eccentricity. We can come back to actually the sort of pleasurable aspects of it, because it's not to dismiss that, right? But what you're saying, and maybe that was your experience too, is that, say for Humphry Davy, his appetite to extend the boundaries of knowledge, of his own research, he felt that actually huffing the nitrous oxide would possibly help. It would give insights. Drug experiences can give us insight, can't they? And of course, LSD is attributed to all sorts of things.
Here is a sidebar about some of the scientific cultural breakthroughs that have been assisted by psychedelics. In 1953, the structure of DNA was established by Francis Crick, who later admitted to have experimented with LSD. Many pioneers of personal computing in the 60s and 70s, including figures associated with the emerging Silicon Valley scene, have spoken about psychedelics fostering systems thinking and interdisciplinary innovation. Steve Jobs famously described taking LSD as one of the 2 or 3 most important things he'd done in his life. He believed it influenced his emphasis on intuition, elegance, simplicity, and human-centered design at Apple. John C. Lilly conducted pioneering studies of dolphin intelligence and human consciousness. His extensive psychedelic experimentation informed his theories about communication, cognition, and altered states. Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the polymerase chain reaction, repeatedly stated that his use of LSD helped him develop the mental flexibility that contributed to his scientific creativity. He called LSD far more important than some of his formal education. PCR became a foundational tool for modern genetics, genome sequencing, forensic science, and biotechnology. Much of contemporary molecular biology rests partly on an invention whose creator credited psychedelic experiences. Researchers such as Jaron Lanier and others in the cyberculture movement have discussed how psychedelic experiences influence their thinking about virtual worlds, networks, and human-computer interaction. Long before psychedelics, Auguste Kekule famously reported that the structure of benzene came to him in a dream or visionary state, involving a snake biting its tail. While not drug-induced, it's often cited as an example of altered states contributing to scientific breakthroughs.
It wasn't just that I'm going to experiment and see what happens with this when I take, various quantities. It was the hope that the effect itself might enlighten him in terms of what he could then discover about consciousness, about the world, about the chemical structure of things.
Yeah, this is just the moment when Kant and Hegel and those German idealist philosophers were starting to say, actually, the world of ideas is the real world. And, this material, physical world around us is just kind of a projection of that. And Coleridge was deeply influenced by that. That was the conclusion that Davy reached on nitrous oxide. This world of matter that looks so solid, that's actually, in a way, an illusion. There's something behind that. And he was starting with his chemistry to reach towards this idea that this table in front of us might not be a solid piece of wood. It might actually be a whole bunch of kind of strange electrical interactions of particles. So it pushed ideas in that direction. He wanted to go further. He wanted to be a pioneer and explorer. It's almost like a sort of colonialism of the mind. I want to put my flag in this territory first. There's people doing very similar kind of things now within sort of contemporary psychedelic renaissance. Imperial College now, there's people working out elaborate ways of drip feeding DMT so that the effects, instead of lasting 10 minutes, last an hour.
Just to finish off with him and nitrous oxide, presumably at some point he stopped doing it, did he? Or was it a lifelong habit for him?
No, he stopped doing it when he went to London. His first series of lectures at the Royal Institution. He was working at the same time on what's called the voltaic pile, sort of early battery. And that was what he used for electrolysis. If you put water in it, then hydrogen collects at one pole and oxygen at the other. So he was into that whole program of stuff that would make him famous. But he did do one night at the Royal Institution on demonstrating nitrous oxide and, sharing it with the audience. Huge crowds. They say that was the first ever one-way street in London because there was a huge traffic jam of all the coaches and carriages all turning up. And so he kind of did his nitrous oxide demonstration and gave it to the audience. And it was like an amazing riotous evening.
I bet.
Next morning, people went to the cartoonist James Gilray's shop, and he'd done this lampoon of Humphry Davy and all the kind of great and good, making sort of idiots of themselves with nitrous oxide, and it all became kind of like a bit silly, and people started taking the piss out of it. And I think because Davy was so ambitious, I think at that point he realised nitrous oxide was not going to take him any further up the ladder. And also his associations with this radical set in Bristol was something he wanted to cut. So, yeah, he took it to London, he made a big splash with it, and then he never did it again.
Gilray's satirical cartoons are very funny. I'll include links to some of them in the show notes. And it did become this kind of spectacle, didn't it? And of course, the Pneumatic Institution itself, people started to hear about it, and, wild goings on, and people would come down to Bristol, wouldn't they, to sort of see what was up and maybe to have a laugh, or maybe, to experience it themselves, some of the wonder of it, also some of the craziness of it. And in fact, the nitrous oxide becomes almost this kind of theatrical performance thing, doesn't it? People tour with these shows where they dispense it to people who go kind of crackers for a while, and everybody has a good laugh, right?
Yeah, and bizarrely, that's the way in which it finally finds its medical application. So exactly the same arc, people have this psychedelic experience and it's amazing, and it's like, oh my god, this changes everything, and then surely this is going to totally transform medicine, or people say about psychedelics today, it's going to revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. And then actually, as time goes on, you realize it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's actually quite hard to find medical applications. So that was what happened with nitrous oxide. Beddoes particularly said, this is revolutionary and it's got to have incredible medical applications. And then, the medical establishment and everyone went, so show us these amazing medical applications then. And they were actually quite hard to find. And what everybody remembered about these experiments were these wonderful lyrical descriptions of the experience. So then, as you say, it became a kind of thing, a bit like stage hypnotism shows today. It was kind of a thing where someone would come on stage and say, ladies and gentlemen, wonders of science, nitrous oxide, come up and breathe some of this gas, and you'll have a very strange experience. You might sing or dance or laugh or recite poetry, sort of priming the audience for a bit of disinhibition and exuberance, right? And this became very popular. It became very popular, particularly in America, on the sort of carnival circuit. And then eventually, this happened where there were doctors and dentists in the audience, and they noticed that people who were taking nitrous oxide and leaping around on stage could actually whack their shins really badly and feel no pain, and would only notice when the gas wore off, covered in blood. It was dentists originally, because their trade was very much limited by the pain of the experience. So they started offering nitrous oxide for tooth extractions and stuff. And that was the way it finally made its way into medicine. And it became anesthesia, the great medical discovery of the modern age. By that time, that was like 50 years later. And everybody had forgotten that, Davy and Beddoes and the Pneumatic Institution had done all this back in the day. And everybody had just laughed at it.
So we got a lot to be thankful to them for, right? For that. I mean, the invention of any anesthetic is a great thing in itself, isn't it? A great move forward.
It is. Beddoes, for all his learning and everything, for him, it all boiled down to, what's the point of all this? Well, the point is to increase pleasure and to minimize pain. That was what was so amazing about nitrous oxide for him, was it gave pleasure and it took away pain. And it's like, this is what we want more of in life, right?
Absolutely. Just to sort of take it forward into the counterculture, because I think there are these parallels. It's almost as though the altered states that these people were experiencing and experimenting with and writing about, for them, they crossed over. So they were having conversations about consciousness, but also they were having conversations about radical politics, right? All the stuff that we associate with the 1950s, 60s and 70s. It was all going on then, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's always a political dimension to it, because if, you huff a big bag of nitrous oxide and you're in this radically altered states of consciousness and really enjoying yourself, one of the questions comes up is this allowed? Should it be allowed?
Right.
Is it going to be illegal? If somebody wanted to ban it, what would be your grounds for doing it? So it begs all those anarchist libertarian questions, I think, really emerge out of that. And also, can we actually have a society when everybody is just wandering around in completely different states of consciousness from one another? Isn't that going to destroy the social contract? What happens to us as a society if everyone's off their heads? So there's always a kind of political dimension that emerges out of those experiences, those states of consciousness.
Right. So in some senses, the sort of psychedelic research that's going on now, it's been talked about as this psychedelic renaissance, but it's not really, is it? Because it's not like the psychedelic experiment ever went away. It was made illegal in the 1960s, but it just went underground, didn't it? So people kept on experimenting, just using the substances and writing about it. In fact, Erowid, people were writing trip reports and trying out all these different things, wasn't it? So, but one of the things which seems to be missing to me is the sort of disruptive aspect of psychedelics is not part of the conversation, and neither are questions that Humphry Davy and Beddoes and their circle were asking about consciousness, or at least not yet, or maybe I'm just missing it.
No, I think it is kind of happening, but it's happening in a weird, medicalized, monetized, commoditized framework. So I think, when people talk about the psychedelic renaissance, they're mostly talking about, psychedelic therapy, and are psychedelics going to be, licensed, and is that going to be legal? And I think the people who are really pushing that, the tech bros and the people we've talked about, they're not interested in kind of legalizing all drugs. Their interest is, can we create a loophole here where everybody else's drugs stay illegal and underground? We've got a monopoly on the legal market. A lot of that is focused on, let's get doing our various trials and getting FDA licensing, and it's all within a medical context that is, of course, incredibly expensive. These are, treatments costing thousands and thousands of dollars, and people are starting to realize now, hang on, this idea of anyone can take mushrooms and trip, right? But if you want to do that in a clinic or in a hospital, that's extremely expensive. Medical health professionals in attendance for hours on end, it's going to cost thousands and thousands of pounds. At the same time, as you say, there's kind of an underground, there's people getting together and doing kind of group therapy for themselves. I mean, we hear about military veterans kind of doing, psychedelic healing groups. That countercultural idea of, let's just get together and do it on our own. Why do we need medical professionals in the middle of it? I think those two strands are both developing. And those bigger questions, I think, are being funneled into, the sort of spiritual discourse around psychedelics, and we can all go off and do our ayahuasca retreats in the Amazon, usually for thousands of pounds, or they're expensive psychedelic retreat centers. And there's a lot of psychedelic churches in America. A lot of legal cases kind of have been won where, if you're a member of this church, you could legally take this. But that's the same as the medical thing. That's about trying to create a little loophole that allows you to do the things that people in the kind of underground or counterculture, it remains illegal for them.
Right, so maybe some of those people involved in that, they're not interested in legalizing it, they're interested in monetizing it.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like I'm kind of dissing the fact that psychedelics are being used to treat mental health conditions. I mean, that's a good thing. It's just more that the massively disruptive aspect, potential of them in the arts in terms of thinking and stuff is being kind of, kept out of the equation, isn't it?
Very much so. I mean, and from the beginning, if you look at the kind of, people who are allowed to partake in these psychedelic trials, if you smoke cannabis or anything, you're excluded. Because psychedelics, the context in which you take them and your expectation and the meaning that's given to you kind of becomes part of the trip. So you see this kind of within the psychedelic renaissance, that all the studies done by people who are into mystical experience, those people have mystical experiences, people who are in part of a therapeutic cohort, they have more medical experiences. And there is already a meaning attached to psychedelics from the counterculture, from the underground, very well elaborated meaning. And I think that meaning has to be overwritten, before the new medicalized, monetized paradigm works.
Yeah, so the free radicals, they weren't just interested in altered consciousness, they're also interested in social transformation, right? I mean, our psychedelic culture, and I'm not excluding myself from this, by the way, has become quite individualistic. My trip, my healing, my journey, I suppose.
And it's happening in a very commoditized culture.
If Beddoes and Davy were alive now, where do you think they would locate themselves? I mean, academics, activists, part of the underground culture, biotech, tech bros, or somewhere else?
Yeah, I think Davy would definitely be in Silicon Valley, or Palo Alto. He'd be where the money is, I'm sure. Beddoes, not. I mean, Beddoes was very, he stayed in Bristol. He carried on doing medicine for the poor, and after the nitrous oxide thing didn't work, he kind of just shrugged and said, well, I'll go back to what I'm doing, which is just trying to make the biggest difference I can. So I think he would be somewhere in community medicines, locally based, very inspiring, charismatic figure.
Mike, Free Radicals, How a Group of Romantic Experimenters Gave Birth to Psychedelic Science is another great book. You have been carried on sort of digging, excavating, rebirthing these lost cultural, countercultural stories. Thanks for that, and thanks for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture again.
Pleasure, as always, Stephen.
thanks to Mike. He told me about his next book. Probably shouldn't give away anything at the moment, but it sounds absolutely fascinating. It's to do with the brain and technology. I think I'm going to try and get him back to talk about it. But his book, Free Radicals, is another highly entertaining, highly surprising read. I recommend it, and I'll put a note in the show notes. There's nothing new under the sun, is it? I've never tried nitrous oxide myself, and this episode, of course, is not an endorsement of it or recommendation to try it. There have been some fairly catastrophic incidents with it, so take care with it, or with whatever you choose to do. And thanks for listening. As I said at the beginning, if you've enjoyed this or other stories and can help support us, come and check out our Patreon, bureauoflostculture.com. You don't have to contribute financially. There's lots of other things there just for free. It would be great to include you. You can just send us some support and some encouragement and some love. And I will see you further down the road, round the bend and over the hillsides for more of these tales from the underground.